before the village fully woke. There was a moment, brief and particular, when the darkness had not quite finished and the light had not quite begun. A moment when the air above the fjord sat perfectly still, and the water below it held the last few stars on its surface like pale seeds scattered across dark soil. The hills on either side were black and formless, their pine trees standing in long, patient rows, and somewhere deep among them a single bird made a sound that was less a song than a question, offered once and then withdrawn. This was the hour when Sigrid opened her eyes. She did not rise immediately. Few did, in those first moments, when the longhouse still held the warmth that many sleeping bodies had gathered through the night. The hearth at the center of the room had burned low, but had not gone out. Someone had seen to it before sleeping, banking the coals beneath a careful layer of ash. The way a good fire is always treated, not extinguished, only made to wait. A thin thread of smoke rose toward the roof hole, and through that opening a square of sky showed itself, no longer fully black, edging toward the color of old iron. Around Sigrid, the shapes of her household lay still. Her husband, Ulf, was closest, turned away from her, his breathing slow and even. Their 2 children had curled together near the edge of the sleeping platform, like a pair of sleeping dogs, sharing a woolen blanket that one of them had pulled almost entirely to her side. The household thrall, a quiet man who had lived with them for 7 years, and whose original name no one remembered anymore, for they called him Brynjolf, now slept near the animals at the far end of the longhouse, separated from the cows and the single goat by a low partition of woven branches. The animals were already stirring. That was the thing about livestock. They made excellent timekeepers. Sigrid rose. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and crossed the earthen floor in bare feet, feeling the packed dirt, the scattered straw, the faint warmth that rose from the stones around the hearth. She crouched and began coaxing the fire back. This was a thing she had done so many thousands of times that her hands moved without instruction, finding the dry kindling stored beneath a nearby shelf, placing it with a precision that looked casual but was not. The coals caught. A small, cheerful flame arrived and stood upright like a thing pleased to exist, and the longhouse shifted around it, its shadows rearranging themselves into something warmer. The village this longhouse belonged to had no particular name that outsiders would have known. It sat at the inner curve of a fjord in the western lands of Norway, in the years that would later be counted as the late 8th century, a time when the wider world beyond these hills was only beginning to learn that it had neighbors it had not considered. The village was not large, perhaps 9 or 10 households, clustered near the water on a shelf of land that the hillside had offered up at some point in the distant past, as though setting a table. Each longhouse was built of timber and turf, long and low, shaped something like an overturned boat, which was perhaps not entirely coincidence. By the time Sigrid had the porridge pot hanging over the fire, a mixture of barley and dried fish and a little fat, stirred with a long wooden spoon that had been her mother's, the children were awake. The younger one, a boy of perhaps 6, came and stood very close to the fire and stared into it, with the complete concentration of a person for whom fire was still a small, daily miracle. The older, a girl of 9, whose name was Hala, went directly to the goat without being asked and began the morning milking with the serious, efficient manner of someone who had learned that goats responded poorly to inattention. Eolf came last. He stood in the doorway for a moment, ducking under the low lintel, and looked out at the fjord. The water had gone from black to gray to a kind of pale silver, and across it the hills on the far shore were now clearly visible, still dark but present, solid, real. A fishing boat belonging to their neighbor Kettle was already out, its small sail, a white triangle, moving very slowly southward. Eolf watched it for a moment with the expression of a man doing arithmetic in his mind, calculating wind and distance and the likelihood of a good catch in weather like this. Then he went to the water barrel near the door and washed his face and hands, shaking the cold from his fingers, and came inside. The porridge was ready. They ate together in the way that families in a warm room with full bowls tend to eat, not with particular ceremony, but with the kind of quiet satisfaction, the spoons moving at an unhurried pace, the steam rising from the bowls and drifting upward toward the slowly brightening square of sky above. Outside, the village was beginning its own morning. The sounds came in through the walls and the door, the heavy footsteps of a neighbor crossing the muddy ground between households, the sound of an axe finding its first log of the day in a series of clean, rhythmic strikes, a dog barking twice and then going quiet, the lowing of cows being released into the yard. By the time the bowls were set aside, the sun had crossed some invisible threshold, and the fjord below the village was full of light, ordinary, abundant, Unannounced, the kind of morning light that makes the whole world look as though it has been recently washed and set out to dry. And in the longhouse, the day's real business was about to begin. The particular quality of a Norse morning in that place, and in that era, was not drama, nor was it urgency. It was, rather, a kind of deliberate and unceremonious readiness, a willingness to move through the hours ahead as steadily and purposefully as the water moved through the fjord below, neither hurrying nor hesitating, finding its own way toward the sea dot. And on this particular morning, in the second week of September, with the first faint edge of autumn arriving in the cooler smell of the air, there was a great deal to be done. In the hour after the morning meal, when the fire had settled into its patient work, and the porridge bowls had been rinsed in the bucket by the door, Sigrid turned to the loom. It stood against the inner wall, tall as a man, its weighted threads hanging in orderly rows, like the strings of some instrument no one had ever learned to play with hands alone. She had strung it fresh the week before, undyed wool on the left, a bundle of reddish-brown on the right, the color drawn from the bark of alder that she had gathered herself in late summer and boiled down in the clay pot that now lived permanently stained. Outside, near the woodpile, she had been working on this cloth for 11 days. By midwinter, if the light held long enough, in the afternoons, and the children did not pull at her too often, she might have enough to cut a new cloak for Elf before the cold came. Properly down from the mountains, Hala sat nearby on a low bench, holding a drop spindle that she had not yet learned to love. She was 9 and preferred to be outside, and her spinning showed it. The thread grew thick, then suddenly thin as a hair, then thick again, in a rhythm that had nothing to do with patience. Sigrid said nothing about it. She had been the same at 9. At 15 she had been better, and at 20 she had been good. And now her hands moved along the loom with a kind of quiet authority that does not need to think about itself. The little boy, whose name was Orm, had gone out early with Brynjolf to the barn. There were 2 goats to be milked, and a pig that had been restless for 3 days. Nothing alarming, only the ordinary irritability of an animal that sensed the season turning. Brynjolf would know what to do. He had come to them 6 years ago, from somewhere east of the mountains, brought by a trader who passed through on his way to the coast. And he understood animals the way some people understand weather, not through any visible reasoning, but through a kind of long attentiveness that had worn itself smooth over time. Outside, the village was deepening into its morning work. From here, through the smoke hole and the slightly open door, Sigrid could hear the sound of an axe splitting wood, steady, unhurried, the rhythm of someone who had enough wood still, but was adding to it anyway, the way prudent people always do in the second week of September. Further away, barely audible over the fjord wind that moved through the grasses along the shore, there was the knock and scrape of a hoe being worked on. That would be Kettle's neighbor, a man named Rolf, who had been saying for 2 seasons that he intended to reinforce the planking on his small cargo boat before next spring's journey south. He appeared to be finally doing it. Sigrid's fingers found the shuttle and drew it through. She thought, without urgency, about the smoked fish she needed to check in the storehouse, whether the wrapping had held against the mice that had been exploring the corners of late. She thought about the barley still standing in the field on the slope above the village. Perhaps 4 more days of work before it was all cut and gathered and laid out to dry, assuming the weather cooperated, which it usually did not. She thought about the cloak. She thought about nothing in particular, in the way that weaving tends to invite. Hala set down the spindle. Can I go to Astrid's house? Astrid was the daughter of Rolf, the boat mender, a year younger than Hala, a compact and serious girl who had the peculiar habit of collecting smooth stones from the fjord edge and arranging them in patterns she claimed were not games. Sigrid looked at the dropped spindle and calculated something that had no name. Take her 3 of the dried plums from the jar by the door. Not more than 3. Hala was gone before the words had finished settling in the air. The loom continued its quiet work. Sigrid shifted her weight slightly on the standing board and let her eyes rest for a moment on the light that came through the smoke hole, pale, gray-white. The light of a September morning that is not certain yet what it wants to be. The fire below it breathed slowly. A small fly, improbably surviving this late in the year, circled once near the edge of the hearthstone, and then left for somewhere else. Brynjolf came back inside around mid-morning with Orm riding on his back and a bucket of milk held carefully in one hand. He set the boy down and the bucket down with the economy of motion that came from carrying things in difficult conditions, and he reported, in his slightly formal Norse that still carried the ghost of another language underneath it, that the pig seemed calmer. Orm added, with great seriousness, that the pig had looked at him. Sigrid strained the milk through the cloth she kept for the purpose, and set the bowl to cool near the wall. The morning drew on. The axe sound from down the village stopped, and was replaced, after a while, by voices 2 men talking. one of them laughing at something, the laughter carrying easily over the open ground between the houses. A dog barked twice and was satisfied. The fjord, visible through the door, in a long silver-gray strip between the houses, lay flat and unremarkable, reflecting a sky that had decided to stay overcast without committing to rain. Elfe had gone before first light to the upper field with 2 other men from the village. There was a stretch of drainage, ditch that needed clearing before the autumn rains made the lower end of the barley plot soft, a task he had been putting off for the better part of 2 weeks, and which had now reached the point where delay would cost more than effort. He would be back by midday, probably hungry, and she had already decided on a soup of leeks and dried mutton with the heel of yesterday's bread. The loom gave back its slow measure. The fire tended itself. In this way, the morning passed, neither quickly nor slowly, but in the particular, unhurried manner of work that knows its own pace and does not need to be reminded of it. The cloth grew by the width of a thumb. The milk cooled. Orm, left to his own devices on the floor near the fire, had found a piece of carved wood, the rough shape of a horse, made for him by Alf last winter, and was walking it along the edge of the hearthstone in a circuit that had no beginning and no end. By the time the light through the smoke hole had shifted from pale gray to something approaching white, the village had settled into the deep, productive quiet of mid-morning, the quiet of people who have found their work and are inside it, not thinking about it, simply doing it, the way a river does not think about flowing but flows nonetheless, steadily, toward wherever the valley opens out below. Later in the day, when the men came back from the ditch and the children returned and the soup was set to heat, there would be the noise and press of family life once more. But for now, the house held only the sound of the loom and the fire, and the small wooden horse making its patient circuit of the hearthstone, round and round, in no particular hurry to arrive anywhere at all, in the way that late morning has of arriving before one quite expects it. The sun had climbed past the roof ridge of the longhouse, and was now falling at a different angle to the smoke hole, casting a pale oblong of light that crept slowly across the packed earthen floor like a patient thing with somewhere to be. Orm had noticed it, as children notice such things, and was trying to keep his foot inside the moving brightness. Sigrid had set aside the loom some time ago. The rhythm of weaving was a morning task. Her hands were steadiest then, her eye most accurate in judging the tension of each pass. And now, the afternoon's particular kind of work was beginning to arrange itself around her. She lifted the heavy iron pot from its hook and carried it outside to the rear of the longhouse, where the light was good and the ground sloped away toward the kitchen plot. The pot needed scrubbing. It had held a mutton and barley broth the night before, and then porridge that morning, and the residue of both had mingled into something that clung stubbornly to the iron's rough interior. She used a handful of coarse sand from a leather pouch kept near the door for this purpose, and a bunch of dried sedgegrass, and she worked the inside of the pot with the particular patience of someone who has done this task so many times it requires no thought at all, leaving the mind free to move about as it pleases. From where she crouched, she could see along the back of the neighboring houses low roofs of sod and turf, a curl of smoke from Rolf's chimney, the corner of the small granary that belonged to old Gunnar's household. A goat had got loose from somewhere and was standing in the middle of the path, between the buildings with an expression of complete serenity, as if it had always intended to be exactly there. Inside, she could hear Orm talking softly to himself, some murmured game involving a carved wooden horse and, it seemed, a great deal of negotiation. She set the pot upside down in the sun to dry, and straightened her back slowly. There was bread to think about. There was always bread to think about. The grain had been ground 2 days before, in long turns, at the quernstone, with Halla's reluctant help, and the coarse flour was stored in a lidded wooden box near the loom wall. Sigrid brought it inside and began the familiar arithmetic of a loaf. How much flour, how much water from the bucket, how much of the small, sealed crock of old sourdough that served as the raising agent, passed down from one batch to the next in an unbroken chain she had maintained for nearly 12 years. Since she first came to this house as a young wife, she mixed it with her hands, turning and pressing the dough against the wooden board until it became smooth and cohesive. Still a little tacky, smelling faintly of something sour and alive, Orm came to watch for a moment, then wandered back to his horse. The dough she left to rest beneath a cloth near the warm side of the hearth, and turned to the afternoon's second consideration, which was the dried fish. There was a rack at the back of the longhouse where split fish hung to cure through the autumn cod, mostly brought up in trade from men who worked the northern waters, and some smaller things that Uolf and Brynjolf caught themselves when the season allowed. Several pieces had been soaking since the previous evening in a clay pot of water. softening their rigid salted planks, back toward something that could be eaten without a great deal of difficulty. She lifted one and pressed it with her thumb, still firm, but yielding. It would do for the evening meal, with some of the dried peas that had been simmering slowly at the edge of the fire since mid-morning, and the bread if it rose well and she could get it onto the hearthstone in time. Outside, she heard the sound of voices approaching, not Ulf's voice, which she knew the shape of from a considerable distance, but younger, lighter voices. Halla returning, and from the particular pitch of the sound, Astrid returning with her. There was a short pause at the door, which always stuck slightly on its lower hinge in damp weather, and then both girls came in, trailing outdoor air, and the smell of wood smoke from some other fire. Halla had collected something in the fold of her apron. She always collected things, and let them fall gently onto the bench near the loom. A few small, smooth pebbles of varied color, a dried seed head from some plant, a piece of birch bark with an interesting curl. Astrid stood just inside the door, with the slightly formal manner she always adopted when entering someone else's house. Hands clasped, eyes moving carefully around the room, Sigrid told her she was welcome, and offered the girls a heel of yesterday's bread with a scraping of rendered fat, which they accepted and ate standing up in the way of children who have been walking all morning and are not yet ready to sit. She asked Halla where they had been, though not with any great urgency. Up past the edge of Gunnar's field, Halla said, along the path to where the old hazel grove was. Had they seen the men at the upper field? Halla thought about this. They had heard them. There had been the sound of shoveling, she said, and someone laughing very loudly about something. Sigrid made a small sound of acknowledgement, and went back to checking the dough beneath its cloth. It had begun to rise, not dramatically, but in the slow, reliable way she had come to trust, a gentle damming at the center, the surface beginning to develop small, irregular blisters. The afternoon was arranging itself into its proper shape, the bread rising, the fish softening, the peas thickening, the girls sitting now on the bench with Astrid's stones spread between them, sorting by color with the grave attention children bring to such projects. Orm had abandoned his horse and fallen asleep on the sheepskin near the far wall, one arm folded beneath his cheek, his breathing slow and even. And somewhere out beyond the village, past Rolf's boat and Gunnar's granary and the hazel grove and the upper field, Ulf would be coming home before long, muddy, probably, and hungry, in the way of men who have been digging in cold ground all day, and the fire would need building up, and the table would need setting, and the whole long, comfortable machinery of evening would begin its familiar turning. But that was still some time away, and for now the afternoon held its quiet shape, the light through the smoke hole, warm and unhurried, the bread doing what bread does in the dark beneath its cloth, the children sorting stones by colors that only they could properly distinguish. In the middle of the afternoon, when the light through the smoke hole turned from white to the color of warm birchwood, Halla grew restless. She had sat with Astrid on the bench for a long while, arranging and rearranging the stones, a flat gray one, a pale piece of quartz. A dark lump shot through with something that glittered faintly when held toward the door. But the afternoon had its own pull on children, something that could not be explained or reasoned with, only felt in the legs and the chest, a quiet insistence that the world outside was doing something worth seeing. Sigrid did not try to stop her. She only called out that Halla should not go past the woodpile, and Halla said she would not, and then she was gone, her small shape flickering through the doorway and swallowed by the pale September light. Astrid stayed. She set her favorite stone in her lap and folded her hands over it and looked at the fire with the distant expression of someone half asleep and half listening to something no one else could hear. Orm stirred once against the far wall, muttered something that might have been a name, and went quiet again. It was the hour of the afternoon that Sigrid had come, over many years, to think of as her own. Not because no one needed her, someone always needed her, or would soon, but because for a little while the needs of the house arranged themselves into a soft lull, the way a stream sometimes passes through a stretch where the current slows and the water runs deep and clear. The bread was rising, the pot was clean. The peas had been simmering so long they had begun to soften into something thick and gentle. The fish still soaked in the wooden trough outside. There was nothing that required her hands right now, only her presence. She moved to the loom standing against the wall near the eastern end of the longhouse, and sat down before it. The cloth on the loom was not new work. She had begun it in late summer, a length of undyed wool, in a simple tablet weave pattern that she intended for a winter tunic, either for Ulf or for trade. She had not yet decided. The wool was heavy and slightly rough to the touch, still holding some of the lanolin from the shearing, and it warmed her fingers as she passed the shuttle through the shed. The sound it made was one of the oldest sounds in the house. A soft, thudding rhythm, steady as breathing. As old in her bones as anything she knew. She had learned the loom from her mother in another village, another house, before she had come here as a young wife. Her mother had been a precise and patient weaver, the kind who could count her tablet turns in her sleep and never lose the pattern. Sigrid was less precise, but had more patience for long work. For the kind of weaving that did not ask much thinking, but asked you to be present in a particular way, attentive to the thread, to the tension, to the slight resistance that told you something had snagged, or twisted 3 rows back. She worked for a while, without counting anything, letting the rhythm settle into her, the way warmth settles into cold hands. Outside, she could hear Hala, somewhere near the woodpile, singing quietly to herself, in the private, unself-conscious way children sing when they believe no one can hear. It was not a real song, no tune, Sigrid recognized. Just a series of small, rising phrases that wandered up and fell back and wandered up again, following some logic that belonged entirely to Hala's own afternoon. The dog barked once at something and then went quiet. A hen walked through the doorway, looked around with a bright and unconvinced expression. Hens carry wherever they go, and walked out again. Astrid fell asleep on the bench, her stone still resting in her lap, her head tilted back against the wall, in a way that would leave a mark on her neck when she woke. Sigrid let her be. The afternoon deepened around her as she wove. The fire needed no attention yet. It had settled into a low, steady burn that would hold for another hour without feeding. The smoke went up through the hole in the roof and out into air that was turning, even now, toward the cooler quality of early evening, not cold yet, but with something suggested in it, the faint edge of what the coming months would ask of everyone. There was always a moment, sometime in September, when she felt the year begin to lean, not fall, not yet lean, like a tall man, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. The gardens were mostly given over. The grain was in. There were still tasks, always still tasks, but they had begun to acquire the particular feeling of preparation rather than abundance, mending, filling, storing, checking the condition of roof thatch, watching the animals for signs of winter weakness, thinking about what would be enough and what would not quite be. She passed the shuttle through again and listened to the house around her. The peas in the pot murmured softly, a low domestic sound, just at the edge of hearing. Outside, Hala's singing had changed into something that sounded like a conversation with an imaginary companion, questions and answers, in a small grave voice. The wind moved along the outside of the longhouse with a low, continuous sound, like a slow exhale. Sigrid thought about the fish. She would lift it from its trough before the light went, and see whether it was soft enough. If not, she would leave it another night and find something else to add to the peas. They had dried mushrooms hung from the rafter near the south end, strung in the autumn of last year, still holding their dark concentration of flavor. 1 or 2 of those, crumbled into the pot, would be enough. She did not hear Ulf coming until he was nearly at the door. His voice reached her first low, speaking to someone just outside, and then the sound of feet on the threshold. And then he stepped in, out of the fading afternoon light, still wearing his outdoor things, bringing with him the smell of cold air and wood smoke, and the particular, muddy sharpness of the path that ran along the lower field. He paused just inside the door, as people do when they come from outside, into the warmth and the dimness, letting their eyes adjust and their body remember the interior world. He looked at Astrid, sleeping on the bench, at the loom, at Sigrid, still holding the shuttle, and something in his expression settled into the ease of a man who has returned to a place that is on balance. Well, Sigrid nodded toward the pot, without speaking. Ulf pulled off his outer layer and hung it near the door, and came further into the house. And the afternoon, that long, quiet afternoon, gathered itself into something new. The particular quality of early evening that begins when the people of a household are all returned to one another, and the fire is built up, and the meal begins, at last, to make its final preparations. In the doorway, Ulf paused for a moment, the way a man does when he is deciding whether to bring the cold in with him or leave it outside. He did neither. Exactly. He simply stood there long enough that the air around him settled, the draft from outside folding itself back into stillness, before he stepped fully over the threshold and pulled the door to, with both hands. He smelled of turned earth and something sharper beneath it, the mineral cold of the stream he had crossed twice that afternoon, checking the lower drainage channel, where the bank had begun to slump in recent rains. His boots left crescents of mud on the stone near the entrance. He did not notice, or perhaps he did, and left the noticing to later. Sigrid looked up from the loom. She did not say anything immediately, and neither did he. This was a long-practiced language between them, the kind that does not require words at its edges, only the occasional word at its center. She watched him cross to the fire, hold his hands out, turn them slowly. The skin of his palms was reddened and dry. He would need the rendered fat tonight. The small clay pot she kept near the south post. Hala came in from the woodpile side, still carrying half an armful of split birch she had been rearranging rather than bringing in, which was her way with outdoor tasks when the air was interesting to her. She dropped the wood into the pile near the wall with a sound like a brief argument, then looked at her father with an expression of complete assessment, the way children do when they are deciding whether to attach themselves to a parent or continue. Being elsewhere, she decided to attach herself. She crossed to where Ulf crouched near the fire and put her hand on his knee without ceremony, watching the flames with him. He put his arm around her without looking down. This too was a practice thing Astrid slept on. She had not stirred when the door opened, had not stirred at the wood dropping. She lay with one cheek pressed against the worn wool of her shawl, her breathing slow and complete in the way that children breathe when they are truly, entirely asleep, as though sleep is something they do seriously and well. The fire needed tending. Sigrid rose from the loom and added a length of birch from the pile Hala had brought in, the cut end hissing briefly at the flame, releasing a thin thread of white smoke before the bark caught properly, and the light in the room expanded by a small, warm measure. The shadows along the roof beams shifted. Above, the dried herb bundles swayed almost imperceptibly in the altered draft. The peapot was still where she had left it, covered with its wooden lid to keep the heat. She lifted the lid and stirred, watching the liquid, thicker, now, darker, the peas having given much of themselves to the broth through the long afternoon. She considered the mushrooms again. She had been going back and forth across the thought all afternoon, like a path worn between two familiar points. The mushrooms were good, and there were enough still strung from the rafter, but they were from last autumn's careful gathering. A morning she remembered well, Hala walking beside her with a basket twice her size, the forest floor still damp, the smell of moss and cold, and the faint sweetness of birch coming down from above. She did not want to use them carelessly. She reached up and unstrung 4 from the rafter, only 4, and laid them on the board near the pot. They were small and dark and papery, still holding their shape, the way things that have dried slowly in good air tend to hold their shape. She poured a small amount of warm water over them in a clay cup and set them to soak at the edge of the fire, where the warmth was gentle. Ulf turned from the fire and watched this without asking questions. He had learned to read the kitchen the way he read the field, by what was present, what had moved, what was added, and in what proportion. He could tell from the state of the pot and the addition of the mushrooms that Sigrid was pleased with how the afternoon had gone, or at least at peace with it, which was its own kind of pleasure. He said, finally, that the drainage channel would need another hour of work in the morning if the rain did not return overnight, and that he had spoken briefly to Kotil at the field boundary. Kotil's eldest boy was ill with a cough, and had been since the last full moon, and there was some worry about whether it would settle in the chest. Sigrid made a small sound that meant she had heard and was thinking about it. She would consider what she had that might help, whether there was anything to send over. She had dried yarrow still, and a little of the elderflower pressed into fat earlier in the year. It might be something. She would think on. Hala had left her father's side and was now at the low bench, sitting beside the still sleeping Astrid, watching her, the way one watches something small and puzzling. She was not doing anything, only watching, with a slightly tilted head. The firelight moved across both of them, the sleeping child and the watchful one. The mushrooms in their cup were beginning to soften. Their smell, released slowly into the warm air of the room, was earthy and quiet and faintly sweet, the smell of forest floor in autumn, of afternoons spent low to the ground among roots and leaves, of the season that had only just given way to this one. Sigrid lifted one from the water, pressed it gently between 2 fingers, and found it ready. She added them to the pot one at a time, then poured the soaking water in as well, dark and fragrant with everything the mushrooms had held. She put the lid back on. The evening was assembling itself, piece by piece, in the slow way that evenings in a well-ordered house tend to do. The fire holding, the pot thickening, the light lowering outside the single high window. The family gathered around the center of warmth without having been summoned to it, simply drawn there by the oldest and most reliable of all instincts. Ulf moved to find the fat for his hands. Hala began to explain something to the sleeping Astrid in a low, unhurried voice, as though continuing a conversation they had been having earlier. Astrid did not wake. The loom stood at rest in its corner, its half-finished length of wool suspended in the last of the afternoon light, and the room filled gradually with the smell of peas and mushrooms and wood smoke, and the evening drew in close around the walls of the house. The peapot had been sitting over the coals long enough now that its smell had changed, no longer sharp and raw, but settled and slow, the kind of warmth that fills a room without announcing itself. Sigrid lifted the lid once, with the hem of her apron folded twice over her hand, stirred the contents in a long circle, and set the lid back with the particular care of someone who has done the same thing so many evenings that the motion has become its own kind of thought. Hala sat near the loom, not weaving, just sitting with her back against the upright post, the way children do when they are neither busy nor bored, but simply present, inhabiting a room the way a cat inhabits it, fully, and without particular purpose. She had a small length of cord in her hands, and was working it through a series of knots she had learned from her grandmother. The old kind. The kind that was said to hold something in, or keep something out. Though Hala did not think of them that way. She thought of them as a pattern, and she liked the pattern. Ulf had taken off his outer boots and set them near enough to the fire to dry without scorching, and he sat on the low bench with his feet stretched toward the warmth, one hand resting on his knee, the other wrapped around a wooden cup of water he had not yet drunk. He was not asleep. He had the stillness of a man who has been outdoors all day and finds, when he finally sits, that his body would like to go on without him for a while. The fire did most of the talking. It was Sigrid who broke the particular silence, not because it needed breaking, but because her thoughts had been moving steadily in one direction and had arrived somewhere. She said, without turning from the pot, that she thought she would grind some of the dried yarrow tonight, if the light held, and press it into the fat she had stored since elderflower season. Not all of it, just enough to make a small pot's worth, enough to send across to Catil's household in the morning with a word about how often to apply it to the chest, and how warm to keep the boy. Ulf made a sound. That was not quite a word, but was clearly agreement, the sound of a man whose wife has said something sensible and who sees no reason to improve upon it. Hala looked up from her cord. She asked whether Catil's boy was very sick. Sigrid considered this, with the care she gave most questions that came from children, which was not less care than she gave other questions, only differently shaped. She said that he had a cough that had gone on longer than coughs usually go, and that in cold months, a cough that stays in the chest is worth attending to before it decides to stay longer. She said this matter-of-factly, without drama, in the tone she used when she wanted Hala to understand something true, without being frightened by it. Hala turned this over for a moment. Then she asked whether she could come along in the morning, to Catil's farm. Sigrid said she could, if she was up before the frost was off the grass. Hala went back to her knots. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly, not with any force, just enough to make itself known against the walls of the longhouse, pressing its hands lightly against the timber and thatch, and then moving on. The sound of it came and went, in the way that sounds do when a house is well made. Present, but muffled. Real, but distant, like something heard from the other side of sleep. Sigrid brought the small clay mortar down from the shelf where it lived beside 2 jars and a length of linen wound, around something she had been meaning to use for months. The mortar was old. Its inside surface was stained so deeply from years of grinding that no amount of washing would ever return it to its original pale color, which was fine. The staining was itself a kind of record, layer over layer, season after season. One remedy pressed into the ghost of the last dot. She measured out 4 pinches of dried yarrow from the cloth packet she kept, knotted at the top, working by feel and habit more than by any precise count, and began to grind it slowly. The sound it made was dry and whispering, like leaves settling against each other on a cold morning. Ulf watched her for a time, without watching her, the way a person watches a fire, or the way the mind rests on something familiar and is soothed by it without knowing why. Then he said, still not quite looking at her, that Catil's wife had put dried fish heads above the door last week. Sigrid did not look up from the mortar. She said she knew. She said nothing else about it, and Ulf did not press further. It was not for him to have opinions about what Catil's wife chose to hang above her own doorway. The dried fish heads were not something Sigrid thought foolish. Precisely. They were the kind of thing that sat alongside the yarrow and the elderflower fat, without contradiction, a different kind of attention to the same problem. She had hung things above doors herself, in years, when she felt the need to. She simply had her own order to these things, her own sense of what she reached for first, and she kept that order quietly. The yarrow became a fine, pale dust at the bottom of the mortar. She spooned it into a small amount of the rendered fat, which had gone solid and white in its little birch bark container, and worked the two together with a wooden stick until the color had distributed itself evenly, or nearly evenly, which was close enough. She pressed the lid back on, and set it near the edge of the hearth, where it would stay slightly warm, but not melt, and wiped her hands on a piece of cloth already dedicated to such purposes. The pot still bubbled its low, contented bubble. Hala had fallen asleep against the loom post, the cords still loosely wound to her fingers. It had happened the way it often happened, without a visible moment of transition. One breath still engaged with wakefulness, the next already somewhere else entirely. Sigrid looked at her for a moment with the expression that has no name in any language because it does not need one. Ulf saw it too. He stood up slowly, careful not to let the bench scrape against the floor, and lifted Hala, the way a man lifts something he has carried many times and knows the weight of perfectly, settling her against his shoulder, moving toward the sleeping place at the far end of the longhouse. With the careful steps of someone navigating by memory in partial dark, Sigrid turned back to the fire. She gave the pot one last stir, tasted from the end of the spoon, and added a small pinch of salt from the wooden box that hung near the hearth on a short cord so it would not damp. It was nearly enough. A few more minutes. The evening was nearly finished with itself, and the night was very close now, patient and unhurried, gathered just outside the walls, like snowfall, waiting for the wind to stop before it begins. The path to Katil's farm ran along the edge of the birchwood, where the trees stood pale and stripped of everything but a few last clusters of brown leaves that had somehow survived the earlier storms. Sigrid knew this path so well that she could have walked it in full darkness without stumbling. She had done so more than once, when sickness or birth had called her out before even the earliest light. But this morning, the snow softened every familiar landmark into something gentler, and the two women moved through it slowly, not out of caution but because there was no reason to hurry, and because the hush that lay over the birchwood was the kind that asked to be respected. Hala walked half a step behind, which was her habit whenever they went somewhere together, not out of any particular deference, but because she had always preferred to watch the back of someone's head rather than be watched herself. She carried the small bundle of dried herbs that Sigrid had not trusted to her own cloak pocket, something with the roots of meadowsweet and a portion of dried juniper berries packed carefully in a fold of undyed linen. Her breath made a steady cloud in the cold air, and now and then she scuffed her boot against a buried root just to hear the sound it made. They did not speak much on the walk. What needed saying had been said the night before, and what remained unsaid between them was the comfortable kind, not absence, but rest. Katil's farm sat at the lower end of the slope, where the land leveled out before dropping toward the frozen inlet. It was a larger holding than Sigrid and Ulf's, with a longer longhouse and a second outbuilding that Katil had raised 2 summers ago for his eldest son's use. Though the son had since gone south with a trading party, and the building now stored mainly rope and barrels, the farmstead had the look of a place that had once held more people than it currently did. A slight looseness about it, space where space had not always been. The door was already open a crack, which meant Katil had heard them coming, or had simply left it so for the cold air to carry away whatever smell sickness leaves behind in a closed room. Katil himself was a broad man, not tall, but wide through the shoulders in a way that made door frames seem undersized. He met them just inside, and the look on his face was the particular expression of a man who is relieved and also slightly embarrassed to be relieved, as though asking for help were still a new practice for him. Even now, in the middle of his 6th decade, his wife, Randvik, lay near the hearth on a pallet that had been dragged close for warmth. She was a small woman at the best of times, and illness had made her smaller still, her face the color of old birch bark, her breathing audible from across the room. She opened her eyes when Sigrid came close, and something in her expression shifted, not quite relief, but recognition of a kind. Sigrid crouched beside the pallet without preamble and asked the questions she always asked when it had begun. What had changed? What had she been able to eat and keep? Randvik answered in a thin voice, and Katil hovered nearby, adding details she missed or softening the ones she gave with a worried look that he seemed unaware of making. Hala, meanwhile, moved quietly to the far end of the hearth and set water to heat. She had found a small iron cup on the shelf without being directed to it, and she measured the meadowsweet carefully, the way Sigrid had shown her 3 seasons ago when she had first begun to accompany her on these visits. There was a good deal of knowledge in the way she worked, unhurried, exact, not performing competence but simply practicing it. The morning passed in this way. Sigrid stayed at Randvik's side, sometimes pressing a hand to her forehead, sometimes simply sitting with her while she drifted into a light and restless sleep. The remedy was given in small sips, too hot at first, then cooling. Katil brought out flatbread and dried fish for his guests without being asked, and the 3 of them ate standing near the door while Randvik slept, speaking in low voices about the weather, about whether the inlet would hold its ice another week, about a way of Katil's that had been behaving strangely since the first frost. It was ordinary conversation. the kind that fills the space between more difficult things and makes those things bearable by making the world around them feel continuous and unchanged by the time the light through. The smoke hole had shifted from the gray of morning to the slightly warmer gray of midday. Ranvik was breathing more easily, and Sigrid felt reasonably settled in her assessment. It was not something that required more than time and warmth and the meadowsweet tea and someone to sit with her when the nights felt long. She said as much to Katil, gently, watching the tightness leave his face in increments. The way snow melts, not all at once, but steadily, from the edges inward. Before they left, Hala showed Katil how to measure the herbs for the evening dose, repeating the instruction twice in a way that managed not to be condescending. He nodded and held the linen packet with a carefulness that suggested he understood the value of what was in his hands, even if he could not have named the plants by sight. Sigrid paused at the door and looked back once at Ranvik, who had turned her face slightly toward the warmth. That was enough. Outside, the air seemed colder after the longhouse, and the light had a brightness to it, now that the morning's flat gray had not promised. The snow in the yard was scuffed with boot prints and the triangular marks of a dog that had been investigating something near the woodpile. Sigrid and Hala walked back up the slope without rushing, their cloaks pulled close. The path already familiar again, now that the novelty of new snow had worn away into the ordinary texture of winter. It would snow again before the week was out, Sigrid thought. It had that feeling to it, a certain heaviness in the air just above the tree line, a patience in the clouds that suggested they were not yet finished. But that was a problem for another morning, and this one had gone well enough. Back at their own farm, Yolf was outside splitting wood near the south wall, working through a stack of birch rounds with a steadiness that suggested he had been at it long enough to fall into the easy rhythm that lies just past effort. He looked up when they came through the gate and asked, without stopping his work, how Ranvik was faring. Sigrid told him. He nodded and set the axe again. There was supper still to prepare, and the afternoon was already contracting, the light beginning its early retreat toward the short Norse dusk that would come before any of them were quite ready for it. But for now, for this particular hour, the farm felt settled and sufficient, the wood smoke rising from the longhouse, the muffled sounds from the animal shed, the steady, clean sound of the axe, and the two women coming in out of the cold to set the afternoon in motion. Before the world had quite decided to be morning, Sigrid was already awake. The fire had not gone out. She had seen to that before lying down, banking the coals under a careful mound of ash, and so the longhouse held its warmth the way old walls do, as something close to stubborn. She lay still for a moment, listening. Outside, the wind had dropped in the night, and what remained was a kind of held breath, the particular silence that comes when new snow has fallen and softened every edge of the world. She could feel it without looking. The quality of the dark had changed, paler, more even, as if the ground itself had begun to glow faintly from below. She rose without lighting a lamp. There was no need. Her feet knew the path from the sleeping bench to the hearth, the way her hands knew the shape of her own vessels, without thought, without ceremony, simply through the long accumulation of mornings, just like this one. The coals took the new wood willingly, a low crackle, then the first thin tongue of flame, and the familiar shapes of the longhouse swam back into view, the roof timbers above, stained dark with years of smoke, the hanging bundles of dried herbs, swaying very slightly in the draught from the door, the loom in the corner, silent and patient as it always was before the household woke, and Hala, curled on her bench with her knees drawn up and one hand pressed flat against her cheek. Still, fully asleep, Sigrid allowed herself a moment to look at her daughter before moving on. The small clay pot of remedy was where she had left it, covered with a folded square of linen weighted at the edges with two smooth river stones. She checked it. The fat had set overnight into something pale and firm, the yarrow suspended throughout in thin greenish threads, and judged it ready. She wrapped the pot in a length of undyed wool, tucking the ends in carefully, and set it near the door where she would not forget it. Then she began the morning, as she began every morning, slowly, with attention. Water from the wooden bucket into the iron pot on the fire, a handful of oats measured out by feel from the grain chest, the lid of which had swollen with the cold and required a particular downward pressure and a slight twist before it yielded. She knew this. Her hands performed a small negotiation without her needing to think about it, and the lid gave, and the oats were pale and dry and smelled of nothing but themselves, which was a good smell in its own quiet way, the smell of provision, of something held safely through the autumn. Ulf stirred when the water began to heat. He had a long practice of waking to that sound, trained into him over more winters than either of them counted anymore, and he sat up on his bench and ran both hands over his face and looked at the fire with the blunt, uncomplicated expression of a man not yet fully assembled. He said nothing for a while. Neither did she. This was not distance between them, but its opposite. A familiarity so complete that silence had become its own form of conversation. Comfortable and unhurried as old wool. Eventually, he stood, found his boots, pulled them on with the slow deliberateness of someone whose joints were making their usual morning complaints, and went to check on the animals. A cold draft entered when he opened the far door, carrying with it the smell of cattle and damp straw, and the particular cold sharpness of snow in still air. And then the door closed again, and the warmth settled back. Hala woke to the smell of the porridge. She woke the way children do, completely and at once, with no gradual assembly required, sitting up and looking around with wide, clear eyes, as if she had simply been waiting, somewhere just behind sleep, for permission to return. She saw the fire, the pot, her mother's back, and the light coming through the smoke hole above, which was the thin gray blue of very early morning, not yet decided. She remembered then Kotel's house, the remedy. She had been promised she could come. She scrambled from the bench and pulled her overdress on over her shift, and came to stand beside Sigrid at the fire, not speaking yet, only present, which was Sigrid had come to understand Hala's particular form of asking. She was not a child who wheedled. She simply appeared and waited, and made her hoping visible by the straightness of her posture and the careful stillness of her hands. Sigrid ladled porridge into 2 wooden bowls and handed one to her daughter. They ate standing by the fire, both of them looking into it rather than at each other, in the way that people look at fires on cold mornings, not seeking anything, only receiving the warmth and the light together. As a simple and sufficient thing, Ulf came back, stamping snow from his boots, reported that the cattle were, well, that the snow was perhaps 2 hands deep, but had stopped falling, and that the path to Katil's farm would be passable without difficulty. He accepted his bowl of porridge and ate it beside the doorpost, glancing once at the wrapped pot near the threshold with the brief, approving nod of a man who expects competence from the people around him, and is regularly given it. When the bowls were rinsed and set to dry, Sigrid laced her outer cloak at the shoulder with the iron pin she wore every day, a plain thing, no ornament to it, but well made, the kind of object that improved with use, rather than diminishing, and she picked up the wrapped pot and tucked it against her body, beneath the cloak where it would stay warmer on the walk. She looked at Hala. Hala already had both boots on, laced correctly, and was standing by the door with her own small cloak bundled around her and her hands folded in front of her, with an expression of composed patience that she had clearly been practicing. Outside, the village was just beginning its morning. A thin line of smoke rose from Thorvald's roof. Someone's dog barked twice, and then was quiet. The sky above the tree line was the color of iron left out in rain. Not unpleasant, only sober. The kind of sky that promised cold without cruelty. A working day, rather than a harsh one. They walked along the path between the houses, their feet pressing down into the new snow with the soft sound that snow makes when it is deep enough to absorb rather than crunch. And the air smelled of cold and wood smoke, and the faint green sharpness of pine from the forest beyond the fields. And Hala walked beside Sigrid, with her breath making small clouds, and said nothing at all, which was how Sigrid preferred the morning. The way to Kotel's house was not long, and it was familiar, and they walked it together through the quiet beginning of the day. By the time Sigrid and Hala had hung their outer cloaks near the hearth to dry, the afternoon light had already begun its slow retreat, pulling color from the sky the way water pulls ink from a cloth, gradually, evenly, without drama. The fire that Eyolf had coaxed back to full strength before they returned now burned with a low, steady confidence, and the smell of wood smoke had settled into every corner of the longhouse, the way it always did in these short winter days, becoming less a smell and more a quality of the air itself. Hala moved to the far end of the room and began laying out what remained of the herb pouches from their visit, checking each one with her fingertips before setting it in its proper place on the shelf. She did this without being asked, the way she did most things, quietly, and with a particular attention that made even the smallest task look considered. Sigrid watched her for a moment from across the room, then turned to the pot, suspended above the fire, and began thinking about the evening meal. There was barley left from the morning, and a joint of salted mutton that had been soaking since before dawn in a clay vessel near the back wall. Sigrid lifted the cloth from it, pressed her fingers into the meat, and decided it needed another quarter of the day, at least, before it would be worth cooking. She replaced the cloth and looked instead toward the dried fish hanging in a row along the rafter closest to the smoke. Flat, pale, slightly curled at the edges, like old parchment someone had forgotten to roll. 3 of them, would do well enough. Boiled down with onion and the last of the autumn leeks. Ulf came in while she was still measuring water into the pot, bringing with him a breath of cold air and the faint smell of cut wood. He said nothing, only moved to his bench near the door and began pulling a splinter from the heel of his hand with the patient focus of a man who has learned that such things, if ignored, become considerably more inconvenient by morning. The splinter came free. He examined it briefly, then set it aside with the mild satisfaction of a small problem resolved. Outside, the wind had turned. It had been coming from the west all day, a gray, damp wind that carried the feeling of the sea in it without bringing actual weather. But now it had shifted, and through the smoke hole, Sigrid could hear it pressing against the thatch from a different angle. A lower sound, more deliberate. A north wind. She filed this away without quite thinking about it. The way a person files away the sound of a door not fully latched. Eagle had come inside sometime in the last hour. Mud on his boots, and a bright expression that suggested he had been doing something he would not volunteer the details of, unless pressed. He sat near Hala now, watching her work with the herbs, occasionally reaching out to touch one of the pouches and being redirected without words. Hala simply moving the pouch slightly out of reach, her eyes still on her own hands. Egil accepted this without complaint, and instead began pulling at a loose thread on his tunic, unraveling a small length of it with steady concentration, before apparently realizing what he was doing and stopping. The evenings settled in around them, the way evenings do in a house that has been lived in for many years. Not with a particular moment of arrival, but gradually, as the firelight became the main light, and the sounds from outside grew quieter, and the members of the household each moved into their accustomed places without discussion, as though drawn there by long habit, which of course they were. Sigrid added the fish to the pot, then the onion, cut into rough pieces, and the leeks, in short lengths. The water had not yet come to a full boil, but it was moving at the edges, a gentle restlessness just beginning. She stirred it once with the long wooden spoon that had lived by this hearth for longer than Eagle had been alive, its handle worn smooth and slightly darkened at the grip. Hala finished with the herbs and came to sit near the fire, drawing her knees up slightly and holding her hands toward the warmth. She did not speak, but she had the look of someone who is thinking comfortably rather than worrying. The difference was in the set of her shoulders, which had relaxed in a way they had not quite managed during the visit to Ranvik's bedside. Ulf, who had resolved the matter of his hand to his satisfaction, now sat with a length of leather cord across his knee and a bronze buckle in his fingers, working at a repair on a harness strap that had been coming apart for at least 2 weeks. The light was not ideal for the work, but he managed by holding the piece closer to the fire's edge when the detail required it, which it did, periodically, causing him to lean forward with a slight frown before leaning back again once satisfied. Eagle, having exhausted the possibilities of the loose thread, began telling a story, or rather, began the version of storytelling that children use before they have learned to commit to a narrative, which is to say, he began several stories in succession, each one interrupted by a detail that reminded him of another, until the original shape of any particular tale had dissolved into a loose collection of interesting facts and remembered events, delivered in a tone of great enthusiasm and with no particular destination in mind. Sigrid listened with one ear, answered where answers were expected, and stirred the pot. The fish had begun to break apart softly in the broth now, the flesh separating into flakes that drifted through the liquid like pale leaves. The smell of it filled the longhouse, warm and faintly oceanic, a smell that carried in it something of summer and open water, even here in the middle of winter. Even with the north wind pressing at the thatch dot, they ate without ceremony. The bowls were wooden, the broth was plain and good. The bread that Hala had set aside that morning was dense and a little dry by now, which was no great matter. It soaked well, and was better for the soaking. Eagle ate with the focused energy of a child who has been outside all afternoon and is not entirely sure where the food goes, but is confident there is room for more of it. Ulf ate steadily and quietly. Hala held her bowl with both hands and blew gently across the surface before each spoonful, a habit so established it had long ceased to be noticed by anyone. When the meal was done, Sigrid set the pot aside and banked the fire for the night, laying the larger pieces of wood across the coals to burn slowly through the hours until morning. The household arranged itself for sleep in the usual order, with the usual small adjustments of blankets and position, and the fire settled into its long, quiet work. The north wind continued, outside, steady and unhurried, moving across the snow on the roof with a soft persistence that was not quite silence, but not quite sound, something between, like the breathing of the village itself, resting in the dark. Tomorrow, Sigrid thought, she would check on Ranvik again, if the weather held, and there was the question of the loom weights, 2 of which had cracked in the cold and needed replacing before the weaving could continue. And Ulf had mentioned the fence along the lower field, though that could wait a day or two longer. There were always things that could wait a day or two, and things that could not. And the skill was in knowing which was which, a skill that was never fully learned, only practiced, year after year, in exactly this way. The north wind had not gone away in the night. Sigrid knew it before she opened her eyes, before the fire was stirred, or the first gray light found its way between the roof timbers. She knew it by the sound the longhouse made, a low, steady pressure against the walls. Not the gusting and releasing of a passing weather mood, but something settled and deliberate, the kind of wind that had decided to stay. The thatch shifted and resettled with each breath of it. Somewhere near the gable, a rope tapped against the outer planking in a slow, patient rhythm. She lay still for a moment, as she sometimes did, holding the warmth of the sleeping house around her before the obligations of the day began to arrive one by one. The embers in the central hearth still held a faint orange breath beneath their pale ash. Ulf lay on his side, beside her, his breathing slow and even. Further along the sleeping bench, Hala had curled herself small under the wool, and Egil, as always, had migrated in the night. He was half on the bench, half not, one arm trailing toward the floor with the peaceful disregard for gravity that only children and the deeply unconscious manage. She rose, without waking any of them, wrapping the heavier shawl around her shoulders, and crossed the earthen floor in bare feet to reach the hearth. The cold was real this morning, not the sharp, clean cold of a bright frost, but the damp and heavy cold that came with a north wind and low cloud, the kind that settled into joints and made the older people in the village speak of the coming months with a certain quietness in their voices. She fed the embers, carefully dry bark first, the smallest splinters of birch, then slightly larger pieces, then a length of split pine that would catch and hold. The fire responded gradually, as it always did when it was coaxed rather than hurried, and she crouched before it for a long moment with her hands near the warmth, watching the small flames find their shape. Outside, the wind moved over the village in long, unbroken waves. The animals would be restless. The goats especially never liked this kind of weather, not because they were cold, the shelter was adequate, but because the continuous pressure of wind seemed to agitate something in their dispositions, and they would spend the morning quarreling with one another over nothing and stepping on their own bedding and looking at anyone who entered the pen with an expression of personal grievance. Sigrid pulled on her indoor shoes, the soft-soled ones worn down at the heel, patched twice, in need of a third patching that she had been postponing, and began the morning in the order that the morning always demanded of her. Water from the clay jar kept near the hearth, not yet frozen, though cold enough to make her breath visible when she bent over it. The salted mutton would need checking. It had been soaking through the night and would need to be rinsed, changed into fresh water, soaked again. There would be porridge for the morning. There were several things to assess and several things to mend, and several conversations she was already composing in her mind with the practicality of a person who knows that thinking ahead is simply another form of work. The longhouse began to wake around her, the way it always did, not all at once, but in layers. Ufers. Once the fire was established and the smell of something warming reached the sleeping bench, he sat up slowly, rubbed his face with both hands, and said nothing for a long moment, which was his way. Then Hala, who woke quietly and came to the fire with her hair unbrushed and her eyes still carrying the soft distance of sleep. Egil last, as always, retrieved from the floor, who appeared at the fireside with straw in his hair and the unshakable confidence of a child who had slept perfectly wherever he happened to end up. Uf went to check on the animals. He came back with the report that the wind was indeed from the north and steady, that there was no sun to speak of, that the sky had the look of something that had not yet decided between rain and snow but was leaning toward snow, and that one of the goats had kicked over the water trough in the night and he had righted it. Sigrid added this to her understanding of the morning without comment. The porridge was oats and a little barley, with a piece of dried apple stirred in toward the end, the last of a small store she had kept back, the apple sweetening the steam and lending a faint warmth to the smell of the house that felt, on a grey morning, with the wind insisting outside, like a small and genuine luxury. Egil ate without pausing. Hala ate slowly, watching the fire. ELF ate with the focused efficiency of a man who had several things he intended to do today and was already ordering them. They had discussed it the evening before, though not at length. There was wood to be split and stacked before the weather closed in entirely. The loom weights needed replacing, and Hala had said she would go to old Ragnar, who had a store of fired clay ones. She might part with one or two, or at least knew where replacements could be found. Ulf wanted to return to the buckle repair on the harness strap, now that he had slept on how he intended to approach the problem of the tongue, which had bent at a slight angle and needed working without cracking the metal in the cold. These were not dramatic plans. They were the plans of a household that intended to keep itself in order. Through a gray day at the beginning of the cold season, in a village that had stood long enough in this particular curve of the hillside that the wind knew exactly how to find it, and the people knew exactly how to go about their work, despite the fact that it did. Sigrid rinsed the mutton. The water was very cold. She worked with her sleeves pushed back, her hands reddening, moving with a practiced economy of motion. The meat had already softened from the overnight soaking and released some of its salt into the water, which ran grey pink into the drain hollow near the wall. She covered it again with fresh water from the carried pail, pressed a smooth stone across the top to keep it submerged, and noted with quiet satisfaction that by evening it would be ready. The morning settled into its work. The fire held. Outside, the north wind continued its long, unhurried conversation with the eaves and the fence posts and the bare crowns of the ash trees at the edge of the village, speaking in that low and persistent tone that was neither threatening nor kind, but simply present, the voice of a season making itself known, arriving not with drama but with the steady, almost courteous certainty of something that had always been coming and had now, at last, arrived. Hala put on her heavier cloak and went out toward Ragnar's house, her feet careful on the frost-stiffened ground. Olaf settled beside the fire with the harness and his smallest tools. Eagle followed him for a while with questions, then wandered to the door, looked out at the gray morning with its leaning grasses and rattling latch, and came back to sit near the warmth without any particular plan, which was also a kind of occupation. Sigrid stood for a moment at the open doorway, just a moment, just long enough to feel the full weight of the wind on her face, and looked out at the village she had lived in all her life. The smoke from the other houses bent low and sideways. A dog trotted past with purpose, following some invisible errand. Far along the path, a figure moved between buildings with a bundle under one arm, head down against the weather. She would begin the bread after the fire peaked. There were enough rice stores. The mutton would cook slowly through the afternoon and into the evening, with dried herbs from Hala's bundles and whatever roots remained in the cold store near the wall. It would be a quiet day, a working day, one of many such days that made up a winter, each one a small and self-contained thing, sufficient to itself. She stepped back inside and pulled the door closed behind her. The bread began before the light was certain. Sigrid had mixed the rye flour with water the night before, leaving the small clay crock near enough to the fire that the dough would have warmth enough to wake, but not so near that it would sour. In the morning, when she pressed her knuckle into the surface, it gave back with a faint resistance, and she knew it was ready. She did not think of it as a living thing, exactly, but she handled it with something that looked like care, turning it out onto the flat stone she kept for the purpose, pressing it with the heels of both hands, folding it back on itself in the slow rhythm that her mother had used, and her mother's mother before that. The fire had peaked while the house still slept. Now it had settled into a deeper, steadier burn. The birch logs collapsed into a long orange bed of coals, with only a few small tongues of blue flame at the edges where the bark was slow to finish. This was the heat she needed. Too bright, and the outside of the loaf would char before the middle was set. Too low, and the bread would come out pale and gummy, more paste than food. She had learned this not from instruction, but from the bread itself, from years of reading the color and knock of the crust. She worked the dough until it was smooth. There was something almost wordless about the task, a kind of thinking that lived in the hands rather than the mind. The longhouse was quiet around her. Eagle had gone outside with an axe some time ago. She could hear, at long intervals, the soft percussion of splitting wood carried in through the wall. Hala had left for Ragnar's house, wrapped in the old green cloak that was too large for her and trailed slightly at the back. The younger children were still bundled near the sleeping platform, awake but not yet certain they wanted to be. Sigrid shaped the loaf by pressing the dough into a round iron pan, a broad, shallow thing, darkened to near black from years of use, its handle worn to a comfortable grip from the same hands that now held it. She set it on a flat stone. She drew close to the coals. She would not leave it. This was the kind of task that required a particular quality of attention, not the sharp kind, but the patient kind. One eye always returning to the pan, even while the other hand stirred the remains of the morning's porridge into the fire's edge to finish cooking down for the pig. The smell of the bread beginning was one of the better smells in the world, she thought, though she would not have said so to anyone. A warm, faintly sour, opening smell, then something rounder, something that filled the upper air of the longhouse and drifted back toward the sleeping children, who stirred without waking. as if the scent had found them in whatever gray country they were still wandering. Outside, the north wind continued. She could feel it at the places where the longhouse wall met the roof, a faint cold pressure, a reminder. The sky, through the smoke hole, was pale gray, even and lightless, the kind of sky that promised nothing violent but offered nothing kind. Snow, perhaps, by afternoon, or nothing at all. These gray days sometimes simply grayed, hour after hour, until darkness brought them to a close without event. She turned the pan at what she judged to be the halfway point. The bottom of the loaf had begun to set, a faint color at the edge where it met the iron. She pressed her fingertip very lightly to the surface, drew it back, satisfied. The center still yielded. She moved the pan slightly closer to the coals, rebuilt one edge of the fire with a piece of split pine, smaller than birch. It would burn faster and hotter, and then be done, and settled back to wait. The youngest child, Wara, came and sat beside her without speaking. She was 4, perhaps 5. There had been some quiet disagreement between Sigrid and Egil about exactly when, a disagreement neither of them had any real way to resolve. She sat with her knees drawn up and her chin resting on them, watching the fire with the same solemn interest that small children bring to fire, as if they sense in it something older than they have words for. Sigrid did not speak to her either. It was not an uncomfortable silence. The child watched the fire, and Sigrid watched the bread, and the wind moved outside, and the coals breathed their slow red breath. When the knock of her knuckle against the crust came back hollow, a small, satisfying sound, almost like a very soft drum, she pulled the pan back from the heat and set it on the flat hearthstone to rest. The loaf was dark at the edges, mid-brown across the top, and it gave off a dense steam when she tilted it slightly out of the pan, which she took for a good sign. She would not cut into it yet. This was the part that required the most patience of all, leaving the bread alone, letting the inside finish its work in the residual heat of its own crust. She had ruined more than one loaf in younger years by cutting too soon, finding the center still raw and damp, the whole thing collapsing under the knife. Now she left it. Wara reached out one hand toward the loaf. Sigrid moved it gently further from the child's reach, not sternly. "Not yet," she said, the only words either of them had spoken in some time. And Wara withdrew her hand and settled back to watching with an expression of deep, philosophical patience. Egil would come in from the wood when his arms told him to. Halla would return from Ragnar's house with whatever she had gone to fetch, or with news in place of it, which was often just as useful. The bread would be ready before midday. The salted mutton was in 8 seconds soaking, and Sigrid had already thought about what she would put into the pot alongside it. When the time came, root vegetables from the cold store, a little dried onion, perhaps some of the soft gray salt that still remained in the wooden bowl on the shelf above the post. The day was unfolding in the way that good days unfolded, quietly, without announcement, each task following the last with the unhurried logic of necessity and long habit. Wara leaned her head against Sigrid's arm, and Sigrid let her stay there, and the fire settled, and the bread rested, and the north wind found no way in. The loaf had come out well. It sat wrapped in a square of undyed wool on the edge of the table, not quite cool yet, still giving off a faint, yeasty warmth that drifted across the room whenever someone moved near it. Sigrid did not cut it yet. There was no need. The midday meal was still some time away, and there was something almost restful in the sight of it, sitting there, round and whole, asking nothing of anyone. Outside, the rhythm of Egil's axe had slowed. Not stopped, but slower now. Each stroke separated from the next by a longer pause, the kind that told her he was tiring, or thinking, or simply standing still for a moment, with the handle resting in his hands, and his eyes on nothing in particular. She knew that pause well. 20 years of mornings had taught her the sound of his silences, as clearly as his words. Wara had fallen asleep. It had happened the way it always did with her, without announcement, without ceremony. One moment, she had been sitting on the low stool near the hearth, turning a small wooden ring over and over in her fingers, watching the fire the way children watched fires, as though expecting it to do something surprising. And then she had simply tilted sideways against the wall post, her cheek pressed to the rough timber, her mouth slightly open, the wooden ring still loosely held in one curled hand. Sigrid left her there. The warmth was good, and the floor near the post was dry, and there was no reason to move a sleeping child. When the day was still gentle, she turned to the mutton pot. It had been hanging since early morning, the broth building slowly from the bones she had set to simmer before the breadwork began, knuckle bones, mostly, with a small strip of meat still clinging to one of them, and a heel of dried fish added late for depth. The smell of it had settled into the room so gradually that she had nearly stopped noticing it. Only now, lifting the wooden lid and leaning close, did it come back to her fully, dense and savory, with something almost smoky underneath from the low, steady burn of the birch wood. She took the dried onion down from the shelf above the post, the rope of it, stiff and papery, 3 bulbs left from the autumn braid. She worked 2 of them free and sliced them small on the board, her knife moving in the unhurried, automatic way of someone who had done this particular task so many times that her hands no longer needed to be told what to do. The onion went into the pot. She replaced the lid. She added a small piece of birch to the fire, not to raise it, only to keep it. There were other things to attend to before the household gathered. The butter from yesterday's churning was still in the clay crock near the far wall, and it needed to be pressed down and packed more firmly if it was going to keep. She brought the crock to the table and worked it with the back of a smooth river stone, pressing slowly, in circles, until the surface was dense and even. She sprinkled a small pinch of gray salt over the top from the wooden bowl, then covered the crock with a circle of birch bark, weighted at the edges, with 2 flat stones. It would keep. It usually kept. From outside came the sound of voices, Eggles, low and even, and then another, higher, unfamiliar, a man's voice, but not one she placed immediately. She did not go to the door. If it required her, Egil would call. Instead, she went on pressing the butter, listening with the particular half-attention of a woman who has learned to hold the thread of a household and the thread of a conversation at the same time, without losing either. The voices stayed outside. She heard Egil laugh once, a short, genuine sound, not his courtesy laugh, and then the crunch of footsteps crossing the yard, and then quiet again. She was reaching for the salt bowl a second time when she heard Wara stir. The child did not wake fully. She made a small sound, shifted her weight against the post, and settled again with the wooden ring now tucked against her chin like a talisman. Her breathing evened out. The fire breathed with her, almost a long, slow pool of air up through the smoke hole above, the coals shifting and resettling, with a sound like a whispered word in a language no one had ever needed to learn. Sigrid stood still for a moment. There was something about the middle of a day, not the busy morning, not the purposeful evening, but this in-between hour when the bread was done and the pot was tending itself, and the child was asleep, and the man outside was talking to whoever had come, that seemed to exist slightly outside of time, not empty, not wasted, only suspended. A seam in the day where nothing was being made or decided or repaired, and the house simply sat and held what it had been given to hold. She thought about Halla at Ragnar's. She would be back before the light changed, that much was certain, because Halla was a girl who kept her own arrangements with the sun, always home before dusk, always aware of the angle of the light without seeming to watch it. Sigrid wondered idly what they were working on today. Ragnar was teaching her the finer tablet weaving patterns this season, the ones with the diagonal twists that required counting. It was painstaking work, and Halla had come home twice now, with eyes slightly strained from the close attention, but she had not complained. The mutton pot shifted on its hook with a low, liquid sound. Steam crept out from under the lid in a thin white thread and curled upward toward the smoke hole and disappeared. Sigrid moved to the door and opened it, a hand's width, not enough to let in the cold, only enough to see Egil was standing at the edge of the yard with a man she recognized now, Worstein from the farm, 2 ridges over. A quiet man with broad shoulders and a habit of arriving without quite announcing himself. They were looking at something on the ground, a length of timber, it seemed, laid out in the mud between them. Their heads were bent together, measuring something with their eyes. Egil crouched down and ran one hand along the wood's length, his palm flat, feeling for something. She closed the door. By the time the afternoon properly took hold, there would be more to do. There always was. But for this one suspended hour, the house asked almost nothing. The pot simmered. The butter was packed. The bread waited, whole and cooling, on its square of undyed wool. And Wara slept against the post with the wooden ring in her hand, dreaming whatever it was that very small children dreamed in the warm middle of a winter day. The fire settled once more, and the room was still, and the whole long afternoon lay quietly ahead.